Okay, folks, welcome to Arthrology and Biomechanics, or specifically for this particular lecture, arthrology only. Biomechanics, I will stop recording and then restart recording. So I have two separate freestanding lectures for this Zoom meeting. And that way you can view them separately and it's easier to upload. So arthrology and biomechanics. Well, arthrology is basically the study of joints or articulations where one bone joins the other bone. And if I were to suddenly stop sharing here, we would have a plastic model of a knee joint. These usually run like $130 from the school, college and university suppliers. I scored this thing off the internet for like $11.95. I guess an orthopedic surgeon or sports medicine specialist was retiring and they just sold it nice and cheap. So I got it and now we can utilize it. We will basically, you have a couple of bones here, 4 to be precise. We have a kneecap bone, otherwise properly known as a patella, embedded in this plastic rubbery representation of a ligament. We have a thigh bone, more correctly known as a femur. And then down here, bones of the lower leg, a tibia and a fibula. So the two main bones that articulate and mesh here, very specifically the femur and the tibia. The fibula here, it has a different articulation with the tibia. And this patella, it articulates with both, but it acts to transfer mechanical forces as it slides across the knee joint, depending on whether or not we're flexing or extending our leg. So an articulation or joint where 2 or more bones come together and move against each other, move relative to one another's position. Okay, let's just flip that back. We will deal with this knee joint model again, because the knee is really quite complicated. It's a very high performance type of articulation or joint. So 2 bones come together, easy peasy lemon squeezy. However, things are going to get complicated from there. Functionally, in terms of classifying how we define these, and actual physical structures present. So not all movement, not all joints or articulations will necessarily allow a whole lot of movement. So we can classify these articulations based on the amount of movement they allow, or we can classify them based on histology, anatomical structure. So let's just deal with the anatomical classification first, then we'll talk about the functional way in which these are classified. So we have bone to some other non-bone material, some supporting or connective tissue material, then another bone. That's sort of an anatomical, a basis for the anatomical classification. What type of material is it that joins the 2 bones together? Okay, so if we have a bone and then fibrous connective tissue and then another bone, we can call this a fibrous joint. We may also use the term synostoses. So you got 2 bones and not a whole lot of complexity here, just a mass of dense irregular connective tissue that forms what we call a ligament. So remember, if we have a band of dense regular or dense irregular connective tissue, and it joins a bone to another bone or a muscle to another muscle, we call that a ligament. Now, if that same band of connective tissue joins a muscle to a bone or a bone to a muscle, it's referred to as a tendon. And as I've stated before, neither ligaments nor tendons are particularly well vascularized. So public service announcement, bros, don't tear, sprain, or strain, if you can help it in life, ligaments and tendons. They don't heal very quickly. Now, the next category is cartilaginous joints or synchondroses. So with this, you're going to have bone and then a little mass of cartilage. This cartilage could be hyaline cartilage. It could be fibrocartilage. And then you have your other bone over here. So that's synchondroses. And now we get the complicated stuff, synovial joints or synovial articulations. So synovial joint, you have a bone, joint, meshing, articulating with another bone, and then you have this fluid-filled capsule that occurs where the two bones are closest to each other. There can be, this can be fairly simple, it can be crazy complicated. So the knee joint is quite complicated. Other synovial articulations in the body, not that complicated, but the knee is ultra high performance. So we use that as an example. And quite frankly, and quite a few of us later in life, or in my case, early in life, because of a sports injury, our knees are going to give us some major trouble. Okay, so that was the anatomical classification, structural classification. Now, we can also define or classify these articulations by function. Do they allow a lot of movement? Do they allow a little movement? Do they allow no movement at all? Okay, so you can look at the skull and see that the skull is actually not just a single bone, but quite a few bones that are fused together. We have a frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, sphenoid, a zygoma, maxilla, maxillary bone, nasal bone here, lacrimal bone. There are a lot of separate units that join together. And at these articulations, where in this case, say the temporal bone, as I'm circling it with a cursor, articulates with the parietal bone up here, this articulation or joint is not supposed to allow any movement whatsoever. You cannot flex or distort the shape of your cranium because there's something really important inside here called the brain. So functionally, we would say this articulation here, indicated by this little reddish pink line, is a synarthroses or a synarthrotic joint. Now, we can have other joints that permit just a tiny bit of flexing or bending, but not much. And a good example of these would be what's called the costochondral joint. Like I said previously, anytime you see the word chondro, or the root chondro in a word, it refers to cartilage. Anytime you see the word costo, not Costco, but like just costo, like how much does this thing cost me to purchase? Costo or costal refers to ribs. So we got a bunch of ribs here, bony portions of the ribs and cartilaginous portions of the ribs. What's highlighted here in green are basically hyaline cartilage, cartilaginous portion of the ribs, and where bone joins cartilage here, that is a costochondral articulation, where rib joins cartilage here, and then it joins to the sternum or breastbone. These will allow a little bit of flexing as, say, one breathes. When you have to breathe, take in air, pulmonary ventilation, you got to move the rib cage, expand it upwards a little bit or pull it downwards a little bit, elevate it a bit. And that means you're going to have a tiny little movement, a tiny bit of flexion right here where bone joins this green highlighted cartilage. So this is an amphiarthrosis or amphiarthrotic joint, allows only a little bit of movement. Now, if we have a wide range of movement being allowed, then we will refer to this articulation as a diarthrosis or diarthrotic joint. So think about your shoulder. We have an upper arm bone here, and I don't care what they call it, it's not funny. This is the humerus. We have a collarbone here or clavicle, and then we have a shoulder blade or scapula, and then we got some ribs coming around the anterior to that here. This no looky so good here. I see the shoulder being awfully close to the scapula here. I don't see much of a gap. You don't want a big gap here, but I'm kind of hoping just from the angle of this radiograph, the space where there should be articular cartilage and synovial fluid is obscured. This is an intensely three-dimensionally complicated thing. And if you were to just rotate your point of view by 5 or 10 degrees, it might look significantly different here where these two bones meet, but there should be some space and stuff in between here. This being a synovial joint, this technically, the shoulder joint is called the for glenoid fossa of the scapula, humeral for humerus, upper arm bone, glenohumeral joint. This is a diarthrosis. So think about all the movement you can do with your arm at your shoulder joint. There's a lot you can do there. Now, these two ways of classifying joints, there is some overlap, but it's hit and miss. So fibrous joints are usually going to be synarthrotic in that they usually will not allow much movement, but they can also be amphiarthrotic and allow a little bit of movement. Cartilaginous joints typically will be amphiarthrotic. They will allow a tiny bit of movement. Synovial joints are usually diarthrotic, and that they will typically allow a wide range of free or easy movement within a constrained range, constrained by the shape of the bones that meet and form this articulation or joint. Okay, so let's just deal with these categories by structure here: fibrous, cartilaginous, and then synovial. So there's several categories of fibrous joints. Again, we can call these synostoses. And the definition of a synostosis is simply bone, connective tissue like dense, regular, dense, irregular, and then bone again. So what we call the sacroiliac joint, we have this little inferior most portion of the vertebral column here. I'm circling it with the cursor in the center. That's a sacrum, sacral bone. And then we have what are called os coxae, or hip bones. And the two hip bones join to the vertebral column or the base of it at the sacrum via what's called the sacroiliac joint. It does not allow movement ordinarily. Now, for the ladies, as childbirth approaches, there will be a hormonal softening of this connective tissue. So these three elements here, os coxa on the right, sacrum posterior center or posteromedial, and then os coxa bone on the left, they can all flex together. Anteriorly in the front here, where I'm circling with the cursor, that's a cartilaginous joint there. We'll talk about that as an example soon enough. Okay, so that's a synostosis. Now, a sutural joint is a type of fibrous joint or synostosis where you have two or more flat plates, flat sheet-like bones, like the flat bones that form the cranium of the skull. And they'll fuse together and they'll meet at kind of a zigzaggy line. And in so doing, they'll form a larger cohesive structure like the skull. So these are examples of sutural joints. We have a lambdoid suture here. We have a squamosal suture here. And we have a frontal or coronal suture here. And then we have a sphenoid suture down here. Gomphoses, peg in a socket. These are not supposed to allow movement either. A typical example of a gomphosis is your tooth, upper or lower, in the upper jaw or maxilla, or lower jaw, also known as the mandible. So each connection between a tooth and the jawbone that holds it is called, typically nowadays they just refer to them as alveolar joints. When I was a kid taking this class, I had to say dentinoalveolar articulation, or the angry, bitter grad student grading my lab practicals or our lab practicals as undergrads would ding us a half point. Okay, so gomphoses, peg in a socket, think, oh, your teeth in the jawbone. Now, a syndesmosis will allow some movement. You typically have two long bones, radius in your forearm and ulna in your forearm. But we can also have this in the lower leg, tibia and fibula. You have these two bones and then there's this flat sheet of connective tissue. A flat sheet of connective tissue may be referred to as an aponeurosis. That being said, the word aponeurosis typically applies to tendons, not so much ligaments. So you have this interosseous ligament here in between two bones, radius and ulna, and it's going to restrict the movement of the two bones of your forearm. So you can rotate it one way, pronate it, so your palm is, the back of your hand is facing up, the dorsal surface of your hand is facing superiorly, or you can supinate your hand where your palm is facing upwards. So these two bones can rotate around each other, but they're held in check. Their movement is limited by this tough, stringy interosseous ligament. So the radioulnar joint, where radius and ulna articulate and mesh with each other, that is a syndesmosis. Another syndesmosis in the lower leg, tibia and fibula. So we have an interosseous ligament joining the two bones of the lower leg. So this is collectively referred to as a tibiofibular joint. Technically, there's a proximal tibiofibular joint here and a distal tibiofibular joint down here. The structure of these two articulations is a tad different. And again, they'll allow you some limited movement of the lower leg, especially of your feet. Okay, that's it for the fibrous joints. So we have like a synostosis, sutural joint, gomphoses, and then syndesmotic joints. Now for the cartilaginous stuff. So where bone joins hyaline cartilage and then goes back to join another bone, that is a simple synchondrosis. So examples here would be rib to cartilage to sternum. Technically, we have a sternocostal joint on either side here. You can call these sternocostal joints here. You could also refer to this as a costochondral joint. Generally speaking, when you hear the word costochondral, it refers to a different group of ribs. What we have here shown attaching to the breastbone in green. So with a cursor, rib number 1, rib 2, rib 3, rib 4, rib 5, rib 6 are called true ribs. And then we have rib 7, rib 8, rib 9, rib 10. These are called false ribs. The reason they're called false ribs is that then technically a lot of people will say rib number 7 is also a true rib. This stuff down here that's shown in a blue-gray color that's not green, this is also cartilage. This is also hyaline cartilage. But notice all the ribs share the same bit of cartilage and all attach here at the base of the sternum or breastbone. So that's why these are called false ribs. They don't have their own cartilage. Many people do say that rib number 7 is a true rib and just 8, 9, and 10 are the false ones here because they all have to share the same cartilage here. This diagram from Ken Hub disagrees. So you could argue that sternocostal joints apply to the true ribs, and costochondral joints very specifically are the articulation of a false rib and then the shared hyaline cartilage. It takes 1, 2, 3, 4 ribs, joins them to the sternum. Underneath here, between these vertebrae, these grayish blue lines, these are referred to as intervertebral joints, intervertebral discs, or just vertebral discs. And this is fibrocartilage or fibrous cartilage down here. This is not hyaline. So, and of course you can see some up here too, where I'm circling with the cursor, vertebra, fibrocartilage disc, vertebra. Those are referred to as symphysial joints. So here's another symphysial joint. The pubic symphysis, or the Latinized symphysis pubis, a pad of fibrocartilage joining the two hip bones together at the front. That's a symphysis. Now, the difficult, tricky stuff. Synovial joints. They allow a wide range of movement and it's easy free movement. What will typically restrict the range of the movement in a synovial joint is the shape of the bones where they meet. So the knee joint is a complex example of this. So I'll use a knee joint as the main laboratory-based example. First, let's just deal with some simple schematics before we build up to the complete complicated structure. All synovial joints, by definition, are enclosed by a synovial capsule made of dense, irregular connective tissue. So we say it's a fibrous capsule. Now, the parts of the bones that articulate and mesh with one another inside this capsule are going to be covered with articular cartilage. Very specifically, articular cartilage is hyaline cartilage. Okay, we'll deal with this patella or kneecap soon enough. So, inside this synovial capsule, we have this rather interesting fluid. It's called synovial fluid, chemically similar to most other bodily fluids like blood plasma. However, synovial fluid contains hyaluronic acid, also known as hyaluronin, and that makes this fluid thicker. What happens is as this fluid is compressed, its viscosity or thickness increases, which is kind of unique among fluids. The harder you punish it, the harder you jump down and land on your legs, generating a shock load on your knee joint, the thicker this hyaluronic acid that's in this synovial fluid gets. So imagine motor oil, say like a 5-weight motor oil thickens, say 30, 5W30 could thicken to like 10W40 or 2050 weight motor oil as it gets compressed. That's sort of what hyaluronic acid does here. Okay, so the synovial fluid, besides having that material, is also going to have glucosamine as one of the components. There will be glucose, maybe amino acids, definitely oxygen in here, and other stuff. Articular cartilage, be nice to it. Don't get it injured because it's poorly vascularized and very slow to heal. If you tear this cartilage here at an articulation at a joint, damage it. If you go bone on bone, Professor Payne is going to pay a visit to your life and make it very, very unpleasant. So the way to work this stuff, to get this stuff a little bit more nutrients and to help it stay healthier and heal quicker, is to work it. Move that articulation. Have some manner of physical activity. Because when you squeeze the synovial fluid, it's going to go into the cartilage, and then when you decompress it, it comes out of the cartilage. And we call this type of circulation weeping lubrication, where the material is just going to ooze out like tears out of the eyes from this layer of cartilage here. Okay, so what you see here is going to be found in all synovial joints. Now, since we have a femur above and a tibia below, indicating, oh, this is the knee joint or the tibiofemoral articulation, we have a lot of optional equipment that makes it complicated. So, in the knee, we have what are called menisci, cushioning the articular surfaces of the femur above and tibia down here, so they don't crash into each other. Bone is not supposed to hit bone in the knee because we have these fibrocartilage pads called menisci here that I'm highlighting in dark gray here. Best way to think of these is they're like elastomeric shock absorbers. I have a mountain bike, a hardtail, front suspension fork, and it has these little rubber discs you insert if you want to tune your ride from an easy, soft ride to a little medium to a harsher ride. depending on what you're doing, what type of trail work you're doing. So that's sort of how these menisci are. They're like little bumpers in between these bones. Now, we also have other stuff in the knee joint. We have what are called intracapsular ligaments. So I'm circling the intracapsular ligaments here with the cursor. We have an anterior cruciate ligament, which goes from front and the bottom, up and back. And a posterior cruciate ligament, or PCL, starts front and top and goes down and back. So these two crisscross each other inside the knee joint. They'll help stabilize the knee joint and help limit its movement. If you tear an ACL or a PCL, all of a sudden your knee joint is a lot less stable, and it could give out again and cause really big problems. We have extracapsular ligaments in green on the outside. These would be the collateral ligaments. This little bone right down here on this illustration I'm circling. Why am I keep saying circulating? Because I'm thinking about weeping lubrication, supplying oxygen and glucose to chondrocytes in the hyaline cartilage here. That's why. This bone here, the fibula, is always laterally located. So this would be the fibular or lateral collateral ligament, and this would be the tibial or medial collateral ligament. Okay, so everything's labeled here. Again, fibula down here, shaded in gray, always indicates lateral side. Tibia is located medially. So this is an anterior view. This is from the front. And keep in mind, everything I'm circling here, don't break it because it'll take forever to heal. PCL goes from above in the front to posterior and back and inferior in the back. ACL starts bottom front and goes top back. Medial collateral ligament and lateral collateral ligament, they just go up and down, connect the femur to the tibia, and then the medial meniscus and lateral meniscus sit on the flat articular surfaces in between these two bones. I extended this diagram upwards quite a bit just to give myself space to illustrate these things and label them all. In real life, IRL, the femur and tibia are much closer to each other, and you don't have anywhere near this much space available inside this synovial capsule. Here we go, a lateral view. Ermagerd, stuff changes in the lateral view now, doesn't it? So let's orient ourselves. Bones first, femur and tibia. ACL starts at the bottom and front, goes top and back, so anterior cruciate ligament. PCL, posterior cruciate ligament, starts top and front and goes down and back. So PCL is in the back here. We got our fibula here telling us that, we're looking at this from a lateral viewpoint. Now, we have a third bone here called the patella or kneecap. So what the kneecap or patella is, it's a sesamoid bone. So let's stop share real quick and go to the whiteboard and define this. I forgot to mention this in the lecture. Sesamoid, make sure I can spell sesamoid, bones are bones. Whoops, make sure I can spell bones. Why can I not spell? Because I'm sitting at an odd angle to the computer, that's why. So they develop within tendons in response to mechanical stress. Some folks will have tendons or ligaments calcify, and they'll have little sesamoid bones forming in there. Other sesamoid bones occur naturally. An example would be the patella, and that's also known as the kneecap, and something else called the pisiform bone. That's in the wrist. It's very specifically at the wrist by your pinky finger. Okay, so that's sesamoid bones. Let's go back and go to our regularly scheduled PowerPoint here. So this patella, it develops inside a band of connective tissue here. And what it does is it helps transfer the mechanical forces generated by your quads, quadriceps femoris group. There's 4 muscles here. And these quads, these 4 muscles with different origins, but they all have a common insertion where they exert their power through the quadriceps tendon to the kneecap or patella. And then the force is transferred from there through the patellar ligament from the apex of the patella down to the tibia here to a rough textured surface called the tibial tuberosity. So we got this bone going back and forth. Whoa, I did not need to do that. I can mess up my presentation here. We have this patella bone going back and forth across the surface of these the femur and the tibia, depending on whether you flex your leg or extend it. When you extend your leg at the knee joint, basically you straighten it out like you're kicking a soccer ball. When you flex the leg, it's like you're bringing your foot back because you're getting ready to kick that soccer ball, or you're just sitting cross-legged on the couch or something like that. So we have what are called, basically the good way to think of these as gel-filled roller bearings. They're called bursae. So bursa is singular, bursae is plural, bursitis would be inflammation of the bursae, painful. Fibrous connective tissue capsules filled with synovial fluid, and they allow everything to roll across them. Instead of grinding on the underlying bone, they're like roller bearings that can deform and flex a bit as well. So they allow the patella to slide up and down beautifully as the quads contract and extend the leg at the knee joint like you're going to kick that ball, or as the hamstrings, the hammies as we call them on the back of your thigh, contract and flex the leg like you're just going to sit down. Okay, so the simple diagrams here, everything's color-coded because they're all my diagrams, but on typical lab exams, we just have the plastic models in person, in neat space. If we were meeting in person on campus, your model is like, let's stop share. This thing you see here, just not really color-coded. I mean, the menisci are shown in blue, but all the ligaments are the same color, all the bones are the same color. So that's what you'd be dealing with in person or on upcoming lab practical number 2, or maybe a lab worksheet. So here, all connective tissue is blue-gray, all bones are bone colored, and there's not a whole lot to say about it here. This muscle right here, this is the gracilis muscle. Worry about that later when we talk about muscles. Okay, so one other issue before I go to the plastic model is tendon sheaths. So if you've ever owned and taken care of your own bicycles and stuff like that, you know that you have brake cable and shifter cable that's made of typically braided steel. You don't want braided steel cable rubbing against your bike frame. It doesn't matter whether it's chromoly, aluminum, titanium, or carbon fiber. Bicycle frames are expensive things. So you're going to route the cables through what we call sheaths. And on a bike, these sheaths are like encased in PVC with a Teflon liner inside, and then they have little metal ferrules at the end. Our muscles have something similar. So you have muscles generating force, and we have one muscle, one tendon, one bone here in this diagram. In reality, you could have like 9 muscles here and a whole bunch of tendons going through here, past each other, across each other, over the same bone. So you want to make sure your tendon does not rub against bone, or it's going to get inflamed, injured, and then finally give up on you. And when that happens, Professor Payne gives you a visit and your quality of life goes straight downhill. So we have tendon sheaths that protect against that. Carpal tunnel syndrome is inflammation, autoimmune attack of the tendon sheaths in the wrist, what we call carpal tunnels. Not good. So this gets really important in the hands and wrist and feet and ankles. All these little blue tubes here, these are all tendon sheaths that route the tendons from your leg muscles around your ankle and through the tarsal region of the foot. So you have full range of movement of your foot. By the same token, across the wrist, most of the muscles that move the hand at the metacarpals, the back of your hand, knuckles, those are all in the medial part of your forearm, what we would say the proximal end of the forearm. And you have all these tendons passing through these tendon sheaths here at the carpal bones of the wrist. And here's cross-sectional view. It looks quite thick here, but they're actually rather flat in cross-section. And it keeps the tendons from rubbing against your bones, regardless of the movement or position of the hand. Complicated things these be. Okay, here's a simpler synovial joint than the knee. This is the shoulder joint. Again, glenohumeral articulation. We have the scapula, shoulder bone here, and then we have the upper arm bone or humerus. So there's quite a few muscles that have to wrap around the edge of the shoulder joint underneath that main shoulder muscle, which is the deltoid. And there's a lot of pressure on the shoulder joint. So we have bursae in there, keeping bone from grinding against bone and tendon sheath from grinding against bone, muscle and ligament from grinding against bone. And then we have, as an example of the biceps muscle, one of your guns, that has a tendon that has to go up, over, and insert on a shoulder, past the proximal edge of the humerus. So we have this little curved tendon sheath that protects this tendon as it's worked, keeps it from rubbing and scraping against the upper arm. Because again, scraping against bone, if you're scraping connective tissue against bone, scraping bone against bone is really bad. Okay, so that's an example of articulation with tendon sheaths and bursae. Okay, so before I talk about the biomechanics, let's just deal with this model here. So this is a knee joint, plastic model, fairly standard variety that we have in lab. So this is the anterior view. And make sure this is in focus. Yes. So anterior view of the knee joint. Again, up here is a, let's see, I'm going to see if I can't crank up the light in here a little bit. Okay, I just got to make sure I can see everything good here. So here we go. Above the thigh bone or femur, and then down below the tibia, leg bone, and then we have the fibula here laterally. So fibula is always lateral, tibia is medial. That means this here is the lateral or fibular collateral ligament. And on this side is the medial or tibial collateral ligament. Yeah, you better write collateral, as in like that movie with Tom Cruise, Collateral, or you put up collateral for a real estate loan or something like that. Okay, then we have the patella or kneecap embedded in here. This actually does come out, but I don't want to be disassembling this and reassembling it. That's how these models deteriorate in the classroom from heavy abuse. And I don't really want to have to damage this, because if I have to buy a new MSRP, I'm looking at $130 instead of $12 like I got for this one. Hey, if I can buy stuff at 5 to 10 cents on the dollar, I'll do it. Wish I could get Rolex watches and gold and diamonds at that steep a discount. Anyway, we got our patella kneecap here. This would be the quadriceps tendon up here. Quads, thigh muscles or muscles of the anterior compartment of the thigh up here. And then down here, the patellar ligament running from patella to tibia, specifically a raised rough textured area called the tibial tuberosity. Okay, so again, anterior view, lateral view, posterior view. medial view. Let's go to anterior. So lateral, that means this is a lateral meniscus. Medial, that means this is the medial meniscus. Let's look at the back. Technically, this is the back of your knee joint. So this would be referred to as the popliteum or popliteal region from the body regions worksheet. So let's see, we have a ligament here. It goes down and back, but it starts out kind of at the front and up here, or I should say anterior and superior. So this would be the posterior cruciate ligament or PCL. Notice it bifurcates or branches. You don't want to tear either part of your PCL. Also inside here, I'm going to put the tip of this little pen on there, right there. That's a little part of the ACL, anterior cruciate ligament peeking out. Anterior cruciate ligament or ACL starts out front and bottom, anterior and inferior, and goes and inserts on the femur, up and back, posterior, superior. Notice that they crisscross as well. They actually occur on the inside of they insert on the inside of these two rounded parts of the femur here called condyles. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the knee joint as a rather complicated articulation here. Let's see, these nylon screws look like they're number 2, number 2 Phillips heads. One of these years, I ought to try taking this thing apart, but not before I dunk the whole thing in Armor All to make sure it doesn't fall apart on me. Okay, so this knee joint here, you are so totally going to see it on worksheets, quizzes, or lab practicals. So that's why I spent the time going over this plastic model. Now what I'm going to do is stop recording, and we'll start recording again for the biomechanics lecture.